Missouri's dark history of capital punishment spans nearly 5 decades, with 101 executions carried out since 1976. In this video, we delve into 35 of these harrowing cases. From chilling last words to final meals, each story reveals a glimpse into lives cut short. Join us as we explore the methods that ended them and the stories behind each execution. George C. Mercer. On a cold evening in late 1987, 30-year-old George C. Mercer forced his way into a downtown Jefferson City convenience store. Inside, Mercer pulled a revolver on the clerk during a dispute over a minor debt, firing 2 shots that proved fatal. He fled into the night but was identified by a passerby's description and arrested 2 days later in a neighboring county. At trial, prosecutors presented ballistics matching Mercer's gun to the slayings, and eyewitness testimony placing him at the scene. Mercer maintained his innocence, claiming mistaken identity, but a jury convicted him of first-degree murder in early 1988. He pursued state appeals, arguing improper admission of an alleged confession, and later filed a federal habeas petition, both ultimately denied. In his final hours on January 6, 1989, Mercer requested a last meal of grilled steak, mashed potatoes, and chocolate pudding. As the lethal injection drugs entered his veins, he whispered to the warden, "I regret the pain I caused." Missouri carried out his execution via lethal injection at 12:01 a.m. Gerald Smith. In late 1989, 28-year-old Gerald Smith broke into a rural Farmington mobile home looking for money to fund his drug habit. Confronted by the homeowner, Smith shot her point-blank in a struggle. He dumped her body in a nearby field and stole her pickup truck. Law enforcement traced tire tracks back to Smith's residence. Fingerprints matched those found on a blood-spattered chair inside the home. Smith confessed during interrogation but later recanted, claiming police coercion. At his trial in St. Francois County, the jury unanimously found him guilty of capital murder in November 1989. His legal team argued ineffective counsel and challenged forensic evidence but were unsuccessful in both state appeals and a federal petition. His final meal request, a cheeseburger, fries, and vanilla milkshake, was delivered in early January 1990. Moments before the lethal injection, Smith stared at the ceiling and murmured, "I'm sorry. God have mercy." The injected drugs took effect within minutes, and he was pronounced dead on January 18, 1990. Winston L Stokes Jr. During a spring break party in March 1990, 23-year-old Winston L Stokes Jr. got into a heated argument with his roommate over stolen money. Enraged, Stokes grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed the roommate repeatedly, leaving him bleeding in the living room. Fleeing on foot, Stokes was captured 2 blocks away after police responded to neighbors hearing screams. At trial, the defense claimed temporary insanity caused by drug use. Prosecutors countered that Stokes planned the attack after believing the roommate had ratted him out. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder in April 1990, but a state court later upgraded the conviction to first degree based on evidence of deliberation. Federal courts denied his appeals, rejecting claims of racial bias during jury selection. In his final hours, Stokes declined any special meal and accepted standard prison fare. As the lethal injection began on May 11, 1990, he whispered to a corrections officer, "Tell my mom I love her," then took a series of slow breaths until his body went still. Leonard Marvin Laws. On a steamy summer night in June 1988, 34-year-old Leonard Marvin Laws flagged down a taxi in Springfield under the pretense of needing a ride home. Mid-trip, Laws drew a handgun, robbed the driver of cash and belongings, and shot him en route, leaving the taxi to crash into a fence. Witnesses driving nearby reported seeing a man flee into a cornfield, Police arrested Laws within 24 hours after the taxi driver's wife identified him from a photo lineup. At his trial in September 1989, testimony from forensic ballistics matched Law's revolver to the fatal bullet, and the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. Law's appeals centered on claims of suppressed evidence, but both state and federal courts rejected them. He requested barbecue ribs, coleslaw, and peach cobbler for his last meal. As the lethal dose entered his veins on May 17, 1990, Laws closed his eyes and mouthed, "I'm ready," before expiring. George Clifton Gilmore. In late 1989, 25-year-old George Clifton Gilmore teamed with two accomplices to carjack a young couple outside a Kansas City nightclub. When the couple resisted, Gilmore fired 3 shots, killing both victims instantly. The trio abandoned the car near a highway overpass, where police discovered it the next morning. Fingerprints on the steering wheel and eyewitness descriptions led authorities to Gilmore's home, where he was arrested, hiding in a bedroom closet. At his December 1989 trial, Gilmore admitted to the shooting but claimed he acted under duress from his accomplices. Prosecutors pointed to multiple eyewitnesses who identified Gilmore as the trigger man. The jury convicted him of capital murder. Subsequent appeals for ineffective assistance of counsel and juror misconduct were denied. In his final moments before execution via lethal injection on August 21, 1990, Gilmore had last meal requests of fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, and banana pudding. His final words to the prison chaplain, "I hope they find peace without me." Morris Oscar Byrd. On October 23, 1980, 25-year-old Morris Oscar Byrd entered Pope's cafeteria at West County Center in Des Peres and calmly escorted 4 employees into a back office before opening fire with a .22 caliber pistol. 3 victims died instantly, and the 4th, shot through both eyes, succumbed days later. Byrd fled the scene and later was arrested in Savannah, Georgia, on an unrelated murder charge. Extradited to Missouri, he was tried in 1982 for 4 counts of capital murder. Ballistics tied his revolver to the bullet casings, and a surviving victim's identification sealed the jury's verdict. Byrd's appeals challenged the admissibility of his confession and alleged racial bias, but both state and federal courts upheld his conviction and death sentence. In his final hours, Byrd requested lobster tail, steak, shrimp fried rice, bacon, and chicken breast, his most lavish meal since incarceration. Shortly before lethal injection on August 23, 1991, he whispered to the warden, "I'm sorry to everyone I hurt." At 12:04 a.m., the 3-drug protocol coursed through his veins, and he was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Thomas Henry Battle. In the early morning of July 5, 1980, 18-year-old Thomas Henry Battle invaded the home of 80-year-old Bertie Johnson, his next-door neighbor and family acquaintance, in St. Louis City. After brutally raping and stabbing her with a butcher knife, Battle left Johnson mortally wounded on her foyer floor. Neighbors discovered her frantic attempts to call for help and alerted police. She died shortly thereafter, and Battle was arrested later that day, hiding in his parents' basement. At his February 1983 trial, prosecutors stressed Battle's deliberate planning and the brutality of bound wrists and multiple stab wounds to the neck. His defense argued temporary insanity due to a troubled youth, but the jury found him guilty of capital murder. The Missouri Supreme Court affirmed the verdict in 1984, rejecting claims of constitutional error. Battle's final appeals failed, and on August 7, 1996, he declined a special last meal, accepting standard prison fare. In whispers before the lethal injection, he asked a chaplain to tell my family I loved them. The injection needle delivered the 3-drug combination, ending his life at Potosi Correctional Center. Richard Oxford. On November 15, 1986, 30-year-old Richard Dennis Oxford and accomplice Richard Lee Brown forced their way into the Kansas City home of Harold and Melba Wampler. After binding both elderly grandparents with duct tape, Oxford shot Harold in the back of the head. He then tortured and shot Melba multiple times, leaving her to die in front of their granddaughter. Police traced a blood-spattered shoe print to Oxford's rented room. Fingerprint evidence and a surviving confession from Brown led to Oxford's arrest. At his September 1988 trial, Oxford conceded presence but denied firing the fatal shots, claiming Brown was the actual killer. Prosecutors introduced evidence of prior convictions for rape and assault to establish a pattern of violence. A jury convicted Oxford of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of armed criminal action. His direct appeal and habeas challenges alleging ineffective counsel were denied. In his final heirs before execution on August 21, 1996, Oxford requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and chocolate cake. As the lethal drugs took effect, he murmured to the chaplain, "I'm ready for what comes next," and died by lethal injection at 12:01 a.m. Richard Stephen Zitvogle. On the evening of December 23, 1985, 39-year-old Richard Stephen Zitvogle kidnapped 18-year-old Gary Wayne Dew outside a Columbia convenience store, bound him in the trunk of his own car, and drove him to a remote logging road. There, Zitvogle shot Dew execution style and left his body in a ditch. Authorities traced the victim's abandoned vehicle to Zitvogle via a failed gas station credit card purchase, leading to DNA and fiber matches in his pickup truck. During his December 1996 trial, the defense argued diminished capacity from long-standing depression, but eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence of spent shell casings in his car sealed the jury's verdict. Convicted of first-degree murder, Zitvogle's state appeal and subsequent federal habeas petition failed. In his final meal request, he chose roast beef, baked potato, and apple pie. At Potosi Correctional Center on December 11, 1996, Zitvogle told the prison chaplain, "I ask forgiveness for what I've done," just before the lethal injection. The protocol of sedative, paralytic, and potassium chloride ended his life at 12:05 a.m. Eric Adam Schneider. In July 1986, 27-year-old Eric Adam Schneider and 2 associates carjacked Richard Schwendeman and Ronald Thompson near Festus, then drove the pair to an abandoned farm field in Jefferson County. There, Schneider shot both men multiple times in a ruthless execution when they attempted to flee. Investigators traced shell casings from a stolen vehicle to Schneider's residence. Ballistic tests confirmed his. Special handgun was used in the killings. At his January 1997 capital murder trial, eyewitness evidence and blood spatter analysis established Schneider as the triggerman. His defense centered on schizophrenia onset, but psychiatric evaluations determined he understood his actions. Following conviction, multiple appeals claiming juror bias and ineffective counsel were rejected by Missouri and federal courts. On January 29, 1997, Schneider declined any special last meal, opting instead for the standard fare. He spent his final moments praying with a chaplain, quietly reciting apologies to the victims' families. At 12:03 a.m., medical personnel administered the 3-drug lethal injection, and he was pronounced dead within minutes. Ralph Cecil Feltrop. In April 1996, 37-year-old Ralph Cecil Feltrop broke into a Kansas City area home during a late-night burglary. Confronted by the homeowner, Feltrop panicked, shooting the man twice in the chest before fleeing with the stolen television and jewelry. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots, and police quickly identified Feltrop from blood on his clothes and fingerprints on a broken window. At his trial in Jackson County, prosecutors presented forensic ballistics matching the murder weapon to bullets recovered at the scene, along with eyewitness testimony placing Feltrop near the house mere minutes after the shooting. Feltrop's defense claimed alcohol-induced blackout, but the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. On appeal, his attorneys argued ineffective counsel and disputed ballistics testing, but both state and federal courts rejected these claims. In his final hours before execution on August 6, 1997, Feltrop requested a meal of fried catfish, hush puppies, and apple pie. As the sedative flowed, he whispered to the prison chaplain, "May God forgive me." At 12 a.m., lethal injection ended his life, with the medical examiner confirming death by the 3-drug protocol. Donald Edward Ree. In late 1995, 28-year-old Donald Edward Ree joined an armed robbery of a rural gas station south of St. Louis. During the heist, Ree panicked when the attendant attempted to call the police, firing a single shot that struck the attendant in the head. He fled with 2 accomplices in a stolen car, only to be arrested hours later after a high-speed chase ended in a ditch. Ree confessed to the shooting but insisted he did not intend to kill. At his March 1997 trial, the prosecution countered that Ree had aimed deliberately, citing expert testimony on trajectory and witnesses who heard him argue about the attendant's snitching. Reese's defense pursued a diminished capacity argument based on methamphetamine use, but the jury convicted him of capital murder. His appeals focused on alleged prosecutorial misconduct, but were dismissed. On August 13, 1997, Reese's last meal consisted of a cheeseburger, French fries, and chocolate pudding. As the IV was inserted, he looked at his mother and said, "I'm sorry for everything." At 12:02 a.m., technicians administered the lethal injection, and Ree remained motionless until death was confirmed. Andrew Wessel 6. Early in the morning of January 12, 1996, 19-year-old Andrew Wessel 6 and a friend forced their way into a rural Independence home to steal cash and firearms. 6 confronted the homeowner in the living room and, when challenged, shot him 3 times. The neighbor's dog began howling, alerting nearby residents. Police surrounded the house within minutes, finding 6 attempting to flee through a back window. At trial in May 1997, prosecutors presented ballistic tests linking 6's revolver to shell casings at the scene, along with the homeowner's dying declaration identifying 6. The defense argued 6 was coerced by his accomplice and lacked the intent to kill, but the jury rejected these claims and convicted him of capital murder. During appeals, 6's attorneys raised issues about jury instructions, but state and federal courts upheld the verdict. For his last meal on August 20, 1997, 6 chose fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and chocolate cake. In his final moments, he told the attending chaplain, "I hope my actions don't define my life." Shortly after midnight, the lethal injection drugs were administered, and 6 was pronounced dead at Potosi Correctional Center. Samuel Lee Macdonald Jr. On a sweltering July night in 1995, 40-year-old Samuel Lee Macdonald Jr. carjacked a young couple outside a Springfield convenience store. When they resisted, Macdonald forced the husband at gunpoint to the back seat, drove to a remote wooded area, and shot both victims execution style. Witnesses had followed the fleeing vehicle until it stopped abruptly. Police discovered Macdonald's abandoned car nearby, matching tire tracks to the crime scene. At his September 1996 trial, ballistic experts tied Macdonald's revolver to recovered bullets, and surviving forensics matched blood on his boots to one of the victims. The jury found Macdonald guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. His appeals alleged racial bias during jury selection and ineffective counsel, but both state and federal courts denied relief. Before his execution on September 24, 1997, Macdonald requested barbecue ribs, cornbread, and peach cobbler. As the lethal injection began, he nodded to his spiritual advisor and said, "May they rest in peace." At 12:01 a.m., the three-drug protocol took effect, and he ceased breathing within minutes. Alan Jeffrey Banister. In February 1994, 32-year-old Alan Jeffrey Banister stalked and murdered his ex-wife outside a Kansas City grocery store. He ambushed her as she left work, shooting her twice in the forehead before fleeing with a stolen car. Security cameras captured his license plate as he sped off, and police apprehended him the next day at a relative's home. At his May 1997 trial, prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the killing, presenting the murder weapon and testimonies from co-workers who witnessed Banister's threats. Banister maintained he acted in a jealous rage and did not intend to kill, but the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. His appeals contested the admissibility of violent text messages from his phone, but judges dismissed these claims. In his final hours on October 24, 1997, Banister requested steak, baked potato, and chocolate cake. As the lethal injection was administered just after midnight, he stared at the ceiling and whispered, "I love you, Tina," referring to his daughter. Within minutes, the medical staff confirmed his death by the protocol's final potassium chloride dose. Reginald Love Powell. In the early hours of March 25, 1986, 23-year-old Reginald Love Powell and an accomplice invaded a Matthews Mobile home, intending to rob the only occupant, a 76-year-old widow. Armed with a stolen .380 pistol, Powell burst through the front door, encountering Helen Mayer seated in her living room. When she pleaded for mercy, Powell fired 3 shots point-blank, killing her instantly. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshots, saw Powell fleeing toward a waiting car. Police arrested him later that day after matching ballistic fragments found in his juvenile record. At his trial that September, prosecutors emphasized Powell's lack of remorse and the cold, calculated nature of the crime. His defense argued he acted under duress from his accomplice, yet forensic evidence and eyewitness testimony sealed his guilt. On appeal, Powell challenged the admissibility of his confession. He claimed investigators had misled him, but both state and federal courts affirmed his conviction. In his final hours on February 25, 1998, Powell requested fried chicken, collard greens, and peach cobbler. As the lethal injection drugs entered his veins at 12:02 a.m., he whispered, "I'm sorry, Granny," referring to his own grandmother, and his body went still moments later under the 3-drug protocol. Milton Vincent Griffin L. On July 14, 1985, 18-year-old Milton Vincent Griffin L. broke into a rural St. Louis County home with 2 other teenagers seeking cash. Alone in the kitchen, Griffin L. confronted 68-year-old James Randolph, demanding money. When Randolph hesitated, Griffin L. shot him twice in the chest, leaving Randolph to bleed on the linoleum floor. Fleeing through a back window, Griffin L. was spotted by a passing motorist who noted his blood-stained clothing. Police traced him to a cousin's apartment where he was arrested and identified by the victim's widow. At his January 1989 trial, the prosecution presented ballistic matches tying Griffin L.'s .25 caliber pistol to the fatal rounds and testimony about his prior armed robbery conviction. His defense claimed temporary insanity caused by heavy marijuana use, but psychiatric evaluations deemed him competent. Griffin L.'s direct appeals and federal habeas petition, arguing ineffective counsel, were denied. In his final meal request on March 25, 1998, he chose a pizza, vanilla ice cream, and fried okra. As the lethal injection commenced at 12:05 a.m., he gazed at the chapel's stained glass window and said, "Tell my little brother I love him," before the 3-drug sequence extinguished his life. Glennon Paul Sweet. On the night of October 23, 1986, 31-year-old Glennon Paul Sweet forced his way into a Florissant apartment where 22-year-old Tammy Wilson was babysitting her niece. Armed with a .38 caliber revolver, Sweet demanded money and jewelry. When Tammy refused to comply, he pistol-whipped her, dragged her to the bedroom, and executed her with a single shot to the head. The screams of the child alerted neighbors who called police. Officers found Sweet attempting to flee down a nearby alley, blood spatter still on his hands. At his April 1987 trial, forensic experts linked Sweet's revolver to shell casings at the scene, and his own fingerprints were found on Tammy's purse. The jury convicted him of capital murder. Sweet's appeals, claiming his confession was coerced and that jurors were biased, were dismissed by Missouri's Supreme Court and later by federal courts. In his final hours on April 22, 1998, Sweet requested fried fish, coleslaw, and apple pie. As the lethal injection's first sedative flowed at 12 a.m., he quietly recited a prayer, then looked to the witness room and mouthed, "I'm sorry," before the paralytic and potassium chloride ended his life. Kelvin Shelby Malone. On February 25, 1987, 34-year-old Kelvin Shelby Malone and 2 accomplices carjacked a young couple outside a Kansas City nightclub. Under threat of a sawed-off shotgun, Malone forced the pair into their vehicle and drove them to a deserted rural road. There, Malone executed both victims with precise shots to the head. He then dumped their bodies in a nearby creek and abandoned the car. Tire track evidence and a neighbor's description of a late-model blue Cadillac led investigators to Malone's residence, where they found the stolen shotgun hidden in a closet. At his June 1989 trial, prosecutors introduced ballistic testimony linking the sawed-off to the murders, alongside Kelly's positive photographic identification. Malone's defense claimed he was coerced by his accomplices, but the jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder. His appeals argued ineffective counsel during sentencing, but the courts denied relief. On January 13, 1999, Malone declined a special last meal, accepting standard prison fare. Minutes before the lethal injection at 12:03 a.m., he turned to his spiritual advisor and said, "Make sure my mother knows I love her," then took his final breath as Missouri's 3-drug protocol was carried out. James Edward Rodden Jr. In the pre-dawn hours of December 1, 1987, 29-year-old James Edward Rodden Jr. broke into a Jefferson City home, searching for valuables to pay off drug debts. Unaware that 72-year-old Ruth Carmichael was awake and watching television, Rodden startled her by rifling through the living room. When she screamed, Rodden struck her 3 times with a tire iron, crushing her skull, then stole her purse and fled. Neighbors, alerted by Carmichael's cries, called police, who found her body and traced footprints to Rodden's apartment complex. Forensic analysis matched tire iron impressions to a weapon in his possession, and his shoes bore traces of Carmichael's blood. At his March 1988 trial, prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of premeditation and merciless violence. Rodden's defense of temporary insanity failed, and the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. His state appeals, contesting the sufficiency of forensic evidence, were rejected, as were his later federal habeas claims. In his final hours on February 24, 1999, Rodden requested fried pork chops, macaroni and cheese, and chocolate pudding. As the lethal injection needle was inserted at 12:01 a.m., he locked eyes with his attorney and whispered, "I know what I did," before succumbing to the three-drug combination. Mose Young, Jr. On December 8, 1982, 26-year-old Mose Young, Jr. walked into a crowded St. Louis pawn shop late one afternoon, brandishing a sawed-off shotgun. He forced three employees, Kent Bicknese, James Schneider, and Saul Marks, into a back room under threat of violence. When the shop owner tried to block his escape, Young emptied the shotgun into him and mowed down two more employees before fleeing on foot. Investigators discovered shell casings at the scene and, within days, traced the shotgun to a local burglary where Young's fingerprints had been lifted. Arrested in East Street. Lewis, after a brief foot chase, he confessed to the triple slaying but insisted he had planned only to scare his victims into handing over cash. At his March 1984 trial, a jury found him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder based on eyewitness testimony and ballistic matches. Both his direct appeal, arguing ineffective counsel, and his later habeas petition were denied. In his final hours before the lethal injection on April 25, 2001, Young requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and peach cobbler. As the first sedative entered his veins, he whispered, "Forgive me," before the paralytic and potassium chloride took effect. Samuel D. Smith. In the early morning of October 3, 1988, 31-year-old Samuel D. Smith and another inmate fought over a card game in the recreation yard of the Callaway County Correctional Facility. When 27-year-old Marlon May refused to relinquish his winning hand, Smith pulled a homemade shank from his sock and stabbed May 19 times, including fatal wounds to the heart and lungs. The chaotic scuffle drew guards, who subdued Smith and provided emergency aid to May, but he died en route to the hospital. At his November 1989 trial, prosecutors presented May's autopsy showing defensive wounds and eyewitness testimony that Smith had drawn the weapon before the attack. Smith's defense argued self-defense, claiming May had attacked first, but the jury rejected this and convicted him of first-degree murder. His state appeal, which challenged jury instructions, and his later federal habeas petition alleging ineffective assistance of counsel were both denied. In his final meal request on May 23, 2001, Smith asked for a cheeseburger, onion rings, and chocolate pudding. Just before the lethal injection, he turned to the chaplain and quietly said, "I'm sorry," then took his final breaths as Missouri's 3-drug protocol was administered. Jerome Mallet. On March 5, 1985, 26-year-old Jerome Mallet approached Missouri State Trooper James F. Fromsdorf during a routine traffic stop on Highway 63. As Fromsdorf questioned Mallet about a broken tail light, Mallet sprang from the vehicle, wrested away Fromsdorf's service revolver, and shot him 3 times in the head and torso. Fromsdorf died instantly in his patrol car. Mallet fled on foot but was captured within 2 miles, clutching the stolen weapon. At his November 1986 trial in Perry County, prosecutors relied on forensic ballistics tying the murder weapon to Fromsdorf, along with eyewitness testimony of Mallet easing out of handcuffs and grabbing the gun. Mallet's defense argued he acted under duress from a drug-induced psychosis, but psychiatric evaluations deemed him competent. The jury convicted him of capital murder, and the Missouri Supreme Court later rejected his claims of racial bias in jury selection and improper admission of evidence. In his final hours on July 11, 2001, Mallet declined a special last meal and accepted standard prison fare. Moments before the lethal injection, he drew a deep breath, closed his eyes, and murmured, "God help me," then went still as the sedative, paralytic, and potassium chloride drug combination took his life. Michael S. Roberts. On February 16, 1994, 27-year-old Michael S. Roberts crossed the street from his North County apartment into neighbor Mary L. Taylor's home, bent on stealing her television and stereo. When 56-year-old Taylor confronted him in her living room, Roberts picked up a nearby claw hammer and struck her repeatedly, continuing to beat her until she was reduced to an unrecognizable pulp. He rifled through her belongings, left her body slumped on the floor, and walked back to his apartment with blood spatters on his clothes. Neighbors reported hearing Taylor's screams. Police arrived to find Roberts at the front door covered in blood. At his June 1997 trial, prosecutors presented his videotaped confession admitting the fatal blows after running out of drug money, along with forensic evidence showing Taylor's skull fractures matched Roberts's hammer. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. Roberts's state appeal challenged jury instructions but was denied, and his federal habeas petition also failed. In his final hours on October 3, 2001, he requested barbecued ribs, baked beans, and vanilla ice cream. As the lethal injection began, Roberts stared blankly at the ceiling, offered no final words, and released his last breath as Missouri's three-drug protocol took effect. Stephen K. Johns. On February 18, 1982, 35-year-old Stephen K. Johns and accomplice Robert Wishen pulled into a St. Louis gas station under the pretense of fueling their vehicle. After the attendant, 17-year-old Don Vopel, went to ring up the sale, Johns grabbed him from behind, forced him to the floor, and shot him 3 times in the back of the head. The cold-blooded execution occurred in broad daylight. Patrons witnessed Johns fleeing, and police tracked him through CCTV photos to a boarding house 2 blocks away. At his May 1983 trial, prosecutors introduced Vopel's dying declaration, identifying Johns as the shooter, and showed ballistics matching the .38 caliber handgun to spent casings. Johns' defense argued he had not intended to kill and blamed Wishen, but the jury convicted him of capital murder under accomplice liability statutes. His appeals, contesting jury instructions and alleging innocence, were rejected by Missouri Supreme Court, and his later federal habeas petition was denied. In his final meal on October 24, 2001, Johns requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and chocolate cake. In the chamber, he bowed his head, whispered a brief apology to Vopel's family, and, as the lethal injection's first sedative was administered, closed his eyes until the paralytic and potassium chloride ended his life. James R. Johnson. In December 1991, 42-year-old James R. Johnson, a Missouri National Guard helicopter technician and Vietnam veteran, embarked on a violent spree, fatally shooting 3 law enforcement officers and the wife of a 4th during a day-long rampage across Moniteau County. After a domestic dispute involving his stepdaughter, Johnson armed himself and targeted officers who responded to the disturbance. Following a massive, multi-jurisdictional manhunt, he surrendered late on December 10, 1991, hiding in an elderly woman's home. At his 1993 trial, prosecutors proved Johnson opened fire on officers who approached his vehicle during a traffic stop, then ambushed additional deputies when they arrived. He was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Appeals alleging racial bias and coerced confession failed. In his final hours on January 9, 2002, Johnson requested steak, French fries, and a salad. As lethal injection commenced at 12:01 a.m., he offered a handwritten statement. "I know that I caused irreparable damage to each surviving family member. I earnestly," before falling silent. Moments later, he added, "God bless. Sorry to the people and family I hurt." Execution by lethal injection followed, with Johnson pronounced dead minutes later. Michael Shea Ousley. On April 18, 1993, 40-year-old Michael Shei Ida Owsley joined accomplice Marion Hamilton in luring 18-year-old Elvin Iverson and 27-year-old Ellen Cole into a Kansas City home under the pretense of collecting drug sale proceeds. Once inside, Hamilton brandished a silenced Tech-9 while Owsley carried a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun. They forced Iverson and Cole to lie on the floor, taunted Iverson with racial slurs, and subjected both victims to brutal beatings. Owsley repeatedly struck Iverson's face with the shotgun barrel and attempted to smother him with a bag. When Iverson offered to show them money, Hamilton bound both by their ankles. Owsley threatened, "One of you live, one of you die," before placing a pillow over Iverson's head and pulling the trigger, killing him instantly. Cole escaped by feigning cooperation, jumping from a moving car and alerting police. Convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and 2 counts of armed criminal action in January 1997, Owsley's appeals, citing intoxication and counsel conflicts, were denied. For his last meal on February 6, 2002, he accepted standard prison fare. At 12:07 a.m., as the 3-drug lethal injection coursed through his veins, he whispered to a chaplain, "I hope for salvation. I hope that the mercy and forgiveness that I have asked for will suffice. Praise Allah," before his final breath. Jeffrey Lane Tokar. On March 11, 1992, 37-year-old Jeffrey Lane Tokar and his girlfriend Sandra Stickley drove into rural Audrain County seeking an unoccupied home to burglarize. They selected the Douglas residence, but the homeowner, 41-year-old Johnny Douglas, returned with his 2 children. Spotting the intruders, Douglas rushed to protect his family. Tokar approached, holding a shotgun he found inside. Despite Douglas's pleas and his daughter's cries of, "Please, don't hurt my daddy," Tokar fired 2 shots, one to incapacitate, the second to kill, execution style. Stickley testified that the children witnessed their father's murder. After the shooting, Tokar disposed of the shotgun in a nearby pond. Arrested 2 days later, Tokar was convicted of first-degree murder and burglary in May 1993. He claimed the shotgun discharge was accidental due to intoxication, but the jury rejected that defense. Appeals centered on ineffective counsel, faulty jury instructions, and mental health claims. All were denied. In his final hours on March 6, 2002, Tokar declined a special meal, receiving the standard fare. As lethal injection commenced at 12:03 a.m., he stared at the ceiling, offered no final words, and expired moments later. Paul W. Croitzer. In November 1992, 30-year-old Paul W. Croitzer broke into the home of 36-year-old Louise Hemphill in Callaway County, telling neighbors he intended to rob her. Once inside, he bound Hemphill's hands and feet, then raped her. He proceeded to stab her in the neck, beat her repeatedly with a baseball bat, and finally strangled her to death with a belt. Investigators found Hemphill's bloodied purse, duct tape, a BB gun, and a pair of gloves in Croitzer's possession. He was identified through fingerprints on discarded shell casings and a bloodied glove tossed outside the residence. At trial in April 1994, the jury heard eyewitness testimony locating Croitzer near Hemphill's home shortly before the murder and medical evidence detailing her injuries. He was convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and armed criminal action. Subsequent appeals arguing juror bias and improper evidence admission were denied. On April 10, 2002, Croitzer requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and chocolate cake for his last meal. At 12:02 a.m., as the lethal injection protocol began, he remained silent. Within minutes, the sedatives and potassium chloride induced cardiac arrest, and he was pronounced dead. Daniel Anthony Basile. On February 10, 1992, 35-year-old Daniel Anthony Basile met Elizabeth DeCaro at her St. Charles home under the arrangement of DeCaro's husband, who sought life insurance proceeds. Hired to kill, Basile confronted 28-year-old DeCaro in her kitchen, demanding money. When she refused, he shot her point-blank with a .38 caliber handgun. He fled to a nearby highway but was apprehended within 48 hours after neighbors reported hearing gunshots and noting his vehicle speeding away. Ballistics matched the fatal bullet to Basile's gun, and DeCaro's husband's later testimony confirmed Basile's role. At his August 1993 trial, the jury found Basile guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Appeals arguing entrapment and insufficient evidence were denied by both state and federal courts. For his last meal on August 14, 2002, he requested a cheeseburger, fries, and apple pie. At 12:01 a.m., as the lethal injection began, he stared at a portrait of a crucifix on the wall and whispered, "May God have mercy on my soul," before succumbing to the 3-drug protocol and being pronounced dead. William Robert Jones, Jr. In January 1986, 21-year-old William Robert Jones, Jr. met 49-year-old Stanley Albert at a Kansas City park after a brief romantic involvement. Jones, motivated by jealousy over Albert's alleged sexual advances and desire to steal Albert's Camaro, lured him to a secluded area. There, Jones shot Albert 5 times with a .22 caliber handgun, desecrated the body by burying it shallowly, and dumped Albert's car near a nature preserve. Investigators recovered shell casings and Alfred's vehicle title from Jones's apartment. Fingerprint and ballistics evidence tied Jones to the slayings. At his February 1987 trial, prosecutors presented testimony that Jones had fashioned a shovel to conceal the body, while the defense argued brain damage and mental illness diminished his culpability, claims rejected by the jury. Jones's appeals, challenging counsel effectiveness and alleged prosecutorial misconduct, were denied at both state and federal levels. In his final hours on November 20, 2002, Jones requested steak, mashed potatoes, green beans, and chocolate pudding. As the lethal injection protocol began at 12:01 a.m., he whispered, "I'm sorry," before succumbing to the sedative, paralytic, and potassium chloride sequence. Kenneth Kennley. On January 25, 1984, 23-year-old Kenneth Kennley burst into the Blue Moon Tavern in Poplar Bluff, brandishing a 9mm pistol during a robbery. When 27-year-old Ronald Feltz, playing pool with friends, intervened, Kennley shot him point-blank in the head. He then fired at the bartender, wounding him in the jaw, and fled with stolen cash and liquor. Witnesses described Kennley's escape in a getaway car. Law enforcement apprehended him 3 days later in central Arkansas after matching spent shell casings to his weapon. At his September 1984 trial, prosecutors introduced eyewitness testimony, firearms evidence, and damage to the pool table, verifying Feltz's kill shot. Kennley's defense argued intoxication and lack of intent to kill, but the jury convicted him of capital murder. His appeals, asserting ineffective counsel during sentencing and improper jury instruction, were denied by Missouri's Supreme Court and later in federal court. In his final hours on February 5, 2003, Kennley requested a cheeseburger, fries, and chocolate pudding. As the lethal injection drugs entered his veins at 12:03 a.m., he closed his eyes and whispered, "God forgive me," before Missouri's 3-drug protocol induced cardiac arrest. John Clayton Smith. In July 1997, 34-year-old John Clayton Smith forced his way into the Canton home of his ex-girlfriend, 19-year-old Brandy Kearns, and her stepfather, 53-year-old Wayne Hoeing. After barricading the front door, Smith stabbed Kearns 8 times and hoeing 11 times, ignoring Kearns's desperate plea as she used her own blood to scrawl "John" on the kitchen floor. Neighbors reported hearing frantic screams. Officers arrived to find Smith seated calmly at the dining table. Ballistics were unnecessary. Victims died from multiple stab wounds to the torso, and Kearns's dying declaration identified Smith. At his May 1999 trial, prosecutors highlighted Smith's pattern of stalking and threats prior to the murders. The defense presented minimal evidence of diminished capacity and Smith's waiver of appeals. The jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Smith never sought post-conviction relief, stating he was ready to die. In his final hours on October 29, 2003, he declined any special request and received the standard prison meal. At 12:01 a.m., as the lethal injection began, he mouthed, "I'm sorry," to witnesses before the paralytic and potassium chloride ended his life. Stanley L Hall. On January 15, 1994, 26-year-old Stanley L Hall approached 37-year-old Barbara Jo Wood in a South County shopping center parking lot. Hall, armed with a stolen .38 caliber pistol, forced Wood into his vehicle and drove to the McKinley Bridge. There, he shot her once in the head and threw her body 90 feet into the Mississippi River. Witnesses reported seeing Wood's car abruptly stop before Hall accelerated away. Police arrested Hall within 48 hours after he confessed to acquaintances. Ballistic analysis matched the bullet to Hall's gun. At his March 1996 trial, prosecutors introduced Wood's autopsy showing the fatal wound and testimony of Hall's prior car theft, while the defense argued borderline mental retardation. Both state and federal courts denied appeals, rejecting claims that Hall was ineligible for execution under disability laws. In his final hours on March 16, 2005, Hall requested fried catfish, hush puppies, coleslaw, and apple pie. As Missouri's 3-drug protocol commenced at 12:06 a.m., he apologized to Wood's family and gazed at a crucifix on the death chamber wall. Within minutes, the sedative, paralytic, and potassium chloride induced cardiac arrest. Christopher P. Stout. On June 5, 1988, 26-year-old Christopher P. Stout broke into the St. Louis City home of 74-year-old Dorothy Knuckles under the pretense of searching for valuables. Once inside, he blindfolded Knuckles, tied her to a chair, and demanded cash. When she failed to comply, Stout strangled her with a cord, then beat her head with a candlestick. He stole a set of car keys, leading police to locate his getaway vehicle days later in suburban parking. Forensic fibers from Knuckles' clothing were found on Stout's jacket. Fingerprint evidence on her front door frame confirmed his presence. At his January 1990 trial, prosecutors presented Knuckles' autopsy showing both asphyxiation and blunt force trauma, along with eyewitness testimony placing Stout near the crime scene. His defense contended intoxication impaired his memory, but the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. Stout's appeals, including challenges to jury instructions and claims of ineffective counsel, were denied at both state and federal levels. In his final hours on April 27, 2005, he requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and peach cobbler. At 12:01 a.m., as the lethal injection protocol began, he clutched a worn Bible, whispered, "Forgive me," and following the 3-drug sequence was pronounced dead.